In 1971, Jerry Weigert and Lee Brown become partners in Vector, with Lee paying for everything.
I'm Lee Brown, the owner of Precision Auto Body, the original constructor of the Vector 1. Jerry had been looking for somebody to build a supercar, if you will. He had some initial sketches and eventually put a clay model together.
Some of the early ideas for the Grand Touring car are using a rotary engine or using a V8 front-wheel drive setup from an Olds Tornado, which could be flipped around to go in the rear of the car. Jerry wanted a jet fighter for the street. He always said he wanted to join the Air Force and become a fighter pilot, but his eyes were not good enough. Lee tried to explain that the typical customer for an American exotic is not going to drive 200 miles an hour across country. He's just going to cruise up and down Sunset Boulevard, looking cool and burning rubber at stoplights. But first things first. And the first thing they need is a car, or at least a full-scale mock-up. Lee tells Jerry he knows where they can get an old race car to use as the chassis of their sports car. Lee buys an old SCCA race car that has been sitting behind a gas station on Hollywood Boulevard for almost 10 years. This is an old Dolphin race car that was built in San Diego in 1963. It is the only Dolphin race car with a 4-cam Porsche engine. It was also owned and driven by Lee's close friend and racing buddy, Ken Miles. In fact, Lee told me that when Ken Miles was locked out of his shop by the government, Lee was the guy who used his truck to help Ken liberate his toolboxes. Lee's body shop was only a mile or two from Ken's engine shop, so they took the tools and what they could over to Lee's place for safekeeping. At Lee's house in Hollywood, Lee and Jerry cut the body off of Ken Miles' old Dolphin race car and began building the first mock-up for what would eventually become the first Vector. After about a year, the guys had a finished rolling chassis with a full-scale mock-up of their Vector body. According to Lee Brown, the name Vector came from one of Jerry's friends. Years later, Jerry would refer to this car as the Vector W1. The font on the Vector also resembled the font for James Bond, aka 007. One of the issues with the mock-up was that with all the wood stations, or ribs like on an airplane wing, the wood panels and Bondo, there is no room inside to sit and steer the car.
It didn't have any free space on the inside.
To make it easier to transport, they cut the car into 3 sections.
The nose panel, the center section, and the tail were 3 separate pieces.
Each of the 3 sections is mounted on casters and wheeled into place at car shows and exhibits. At the shows, the 3 sections are latched together and the Vector looks like a complete car on display. The car is initially painted white, like most prototype cars, but at some point the car is then painted pea soup green, according to Lee Brown. The car is photographed outside at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Hollywood, where they used to host the Academy Awards. These photos are used for the flyer that Jerry and Lee will hand out at the shows. After about a year and a half of working together and showing the car, Jerry and Lee went their separate ways. Jerry kept wanting to make changes, and Lee wanted to sell some cars and start making his money back.
We didn't have, as far as looks went of the car, we got along real well on that. We parted ways before we got down to building the car with an engine.
Lee kept the car because he had paid for everything. Jerry took his designs and went his way. He realized he could not be partners with anyone if he wanted to build his car. After a while, the Vector began to deteriorate because it was just a mock-up and not meant to last. Lee said he eventually threw it in the dumpster. I talked to a man called Phil Binks who used to race Dolphin race cars and also knew Ken Miles. He said he knew the person who restored Ken Miles' old Dolphin race car. I had seen some stories about Ken's car being rebuilt and eventually sold for over $1 million. I was not 100% sure it was the same car, but Phil told me the Dolphin frame had been cut into 3 pieces, and he never knew why until I told him the story.
All right, so this body is from the Ken Miles Dolphin 2-seater. It was most recently owned by Joe DiLoretto, who passed away probably about a year ago. According to David Woodhouse, DiLoretto's car was sold, the original Ken Miles Dolphin. No, he had actually the frame and everything.
Oh, he had both. He had the frame
but
and...
he had a newer body made to race, and this is the original body, and it has the original Dolphin emblem
Yeah.
So my brother owns the Ken Miles single-seater Formula G.
Yeah, he's got the green one, yeah.
1961, the green one. And then David Woodhouse has the one that came just after that, so it would have been after 61. It's a little bit longer.
Right.
And I gave David Woodhouse like all of the notes that my dad had on dolphin history and
Woodhouse
photographs.
has everything,
Woodhouse
really?
has all of that.
Wow.
Yeah.